Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to today's event. We would like to welcome everyone to the Louis R. Brookhiser Memorial Lecture, an annual lecture series sponsored by the University Press Club. My name is Louise Conley, and I, along with Oren Fliegelman, am one of the co-presidents of the University Press Club, which for over 100 years has allowed a small group of undergraduate students to write professionally for regional and national publications. We are also the group behind the campus blog, The Ink. Today's event is in memory of Louis Brookhiser, the legendary economic and financial journalist and commentator. Among his many achievements, Mr. Brookhiser created Wall Street Week, the first television program focused on the financial markets. And for over 30 years, Mr. Brookhiser helped explain the complex and often convoluted workings of the stock market to the broader public in an engaging and accessible way. Wall Street Week quickly became the nation's most popular show about the economy, its people, and their money. Mr. Brookhiser was also a proud Princetonian, class of 1954, and a dedicated member of the University Press Club. And I would like to acknowledge the University Press Club's Alumni Advisory Board, especially Bill Brookhiser, class of 61, whose support and dedication to the club helped make this lecture possible. As well as the co-sponsors of this year's lecture, the Woodrow Wilson School, the Council of the Humanities, and the Women's Center. Here to introduce our speaker today is Professor Joe Stevens. He's the Ferris Professor in Residence and an investigative projects reporter for the Washington Post. We hope you will join us in welcoming Professor Stevens.
Thanks so much, Louise. I'm glad you all can make it out because this is promising to be a really fascinating talk. As Louise said, I'm the Ferris Professor of Journalism here, one of them, and I'm kind of new here if you don't recognize my face. But I am deeply honored and take great pleasure in welcoming Jill Abramson back as a former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton. And she's going to be speaking in defense of leaks. Now, Jill is many things. She's an educator, an author, a former Wall Street Journal reporter, a renowned investigative reporter. She is a born and raised New Yorker, and she is a publicly avowed dog lover. She is not boring. People who know her use the terms outspoken and a force of nature. 2 years ago, Jill was named number 5 on the Forbes list of the most powerful women. She recently was listed by Foreign Policy as one of the most powerful people in the world of any gender. She's perhaps best known for a long and productive time at the New York Times, where she spent 17 years in senior management. Last week, I was at the funeral for Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Washington Post, who led the Watergate and Pentagon Papers coverage. And I was reminded time and time again how critical it is to have at the top of a newspaper someone who is bold, fearless, visionary. It's critical for the newspaper and it's critical for the Republic. And Jill, like Ben, is one of those visionary editors. She brings fire and puts life in her troops. And if you read the New York Times, you know that. Jill spent most of the 90s at the Wall Street Journal, where she was a deputy bureau chief and an investigative reporter. In 1997, she jumped to the Times, where she rose quickly. In 99, she was named Washington editor, and then just a year later was named Washington bureau chief. That's no small feat. Jill was once quoted as saying that in her house when she was growing up, the Times took the place of religion. If the Times said it, it was the absolute truth, in Jill's words. In 2003, Bill Keller asked Jill to be his managing editor, and just 8 years later, in September of 2011, Jill took over as executive editor herself. And Jill became the first female to hold that role in the history of that storied newspaper. Reporters say that in the newsroom, Jill was known, among other things, for being in perpetual search of a story that was, quote unquote, juicy. This was new to me when I was doing my reporting. Reporters writing about movie stars, political scandals, or foreign heads of state, no matter the topic, they all lived for the day they would hear Jill read their lead, and pronounce to the room, "That's juicy." And under her direction, the paper won 8 Pulitzer Prizes. Jill left that hard-won post as executive editor on May 14th of this year, in a high-profile, much-discussed departure, and I think it's safe to say her departure was not amicable. And Jill instructed me to say right before I came up here that she was fired. Jill says I'm a truth teller. I have to say that, so I'm doing it. Not one to sit around on her laurels. Jill has forged ahead. Among other things, she has been putting together a new online journalism venture, one that's reportedly looking at paying writers $100,000 an article. And I think all the journalists in my investigative reporting class are interested in hearing more about that. And if you brought a sign-up sheet, they might want to talk to you about that too. And if that's not enough, Jill is currently teaching at Harvard as a visiting lecturer, and her course is Introduction to Journalism, which sounds to me to be one heck of a course. I can't wait to hear what she has to say. Please welcome Jill.
Hi everyone, thanks for, it's a icky day outside, so thanks for making the trip here, even if it was a short one, at least for the students here. And Joe, thanks so much for the nice introduction. Louise, for the invitation in the first place. I taught here at Princeton in the fall term of 2000, and I taught about the intersection of investigative reporting and politics. And because the Bush v. Gore election was underway that fall, it was really a great time to be teaching that subject. And it was on Election Day 2000 that I was then, my title was Washington editor. I was the #2 editor in the Washington Bureau of the Times. And I had come up to New York for election night, and Joe Lelyveld, who was then the executive editor, asked me to come into his office. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he said to me, well, we don't know yet who the next president is, but we know who the next Washington bureau chief is going to be. And he offered me the job that morning, which I was thrilled about. But I remember it mostly because that election night, we didn't know who the president was. It was the famous undecided election night, and I still had, it was, you know, obviously the beginning of November of 2000, I still had, my class was still meeting, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're not gonna know who won the election until the term is over, but the Supreme Court actually did rule before the end of the term. But all of that made my time here very memorable to me. I loved being part of the Princeton community. The brilliance of the students just dazzled me, and the quality of the faculty is unsurpassed. And I have taught at both Yale and now Harvard. And a big thrill for me when I taught here was I asked to have lunch with and meet John McPhee. I imagine every Ferris professor who's a working journalist probably has that same request, but that was just great. And to begin my talk, which is going to be in defense of leaks, I have to say it certainly isn't surprising being here at Princeton today that I'm surrounded by many things that say Woodrow Wilson. You know, this is Princeton, and he has always loomed large here, but he is very relevant to my topic tonight because a pretty obscure law called the 1917 Espionage Act, which Wilson at the very beginning of World War I pushed very hard to get passed, and it was intended to ease the prosecution of spies during World War II. That law, which kind of lay dormant for decades, has been revived in the post 9/11 atmosphere, and it's been used to prosecute leakers, but also to sweep up journalists who publish the stories based on leaks of classified national security intelligence. And many people who have studied that law and have gone back over Wilson's papers to look back at the original intent of the law believe it was never, ever intended to be used to put a chill on freedom of the press here and to involve journalists. But with 8 criminal leak prosecutions that have happened during the Bush and Obama administrations, which is more than double the number that there'd been in all of American history before then, the 1917 Espionage Act is suddenly very much back in the news and affecting the lives of quite a few journalists, including several of my former colleagues at the New York Times. So, and this is going to be a bit of a walk through history. Mostly it's going to be recent history, the post 9/11 environment. But I wanted to begin with a little bit of background before then. And one of the most memorable conversations that I had during my 17 years at the Times was with Punch Sulzberger, who was the father of the current publisher, Arthur Sulzberger. And Punch had been, just a fantastic publisher, and he had a tiny little office still at the Times. This was probably in about 1998 or 1999, and I asked to see him. He had a little office that was called the Chairman Emeritus's office. And I made an appointment to talk to him because I was very interested in the whole history of the Pentagon Papers. And Punch had made the very courageous and fateful decision for the Times to go ahead and publish the Pentagon Papers in 1970. And that turned out very well for the Times. The Times won in 1971 the Golden Public Service Pulitzer Prize, which is the most important of the prizes. But, before publication, Punch had been very nervous because he really was worried that the Times could be criminally prosecuted for publishing this classified material. The Pentagon Papers, for students who may not be familiar with them, were a secret history of the Vietnam War that the Pentagon had commissioned. It was actually a false history of the Vietnam War. It had all kinds of false justifications for the war and false reports about progress during the war. And the Pentagon Papers existed back then. They were on paper. They were 47 volumes. And a Pentagon contractor named Daniel Ellsberg had stolen them volume by volume when he was a consultant working at the Pentagon. He worked for the Rand Corporation, and he would secret out the volumes. And at first he wanted the Senate to investigate the Pentagon Papers, but because they were top secret and stolen, the Senate wouldn't touch the material. So Ellsberg ended up going to a reporter at the New York Times named Neil Sheehan and offering him the papers, and the Times set up a secret office in the Hilton Hotel about 10 blocks north of the Times, and a secret team of reporters and editors worked on reading the papers and trying to work on them and distill them into newspaper stories, and the paper also published a lot of the actual documents. And as I said, Punch was worried that the Times might be prosecuted. And he told me that he was actually, on the eve of publication, he was gardening at he had a weekend estate called Hillendale in Pound Ridge, New York. And he was gardening and he saw a helicopter like flying overhead, and it seemed to be approaching him. And he actually thought to himself, they're coming to take me away. He did. And although there was no effort to prosecute the Times after the Times began publication of the Pentagon Papers, the Nixon administration went to court and they got an injunction against the Times saying, stop publishing this stolen classified material. And the Times actually for a few days had to halt publication of the Pentagon Papers. They appealed the lower court decision all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided on a very expedited basis to hear the case. And in a landmark decision that is a watershed moment for freedom of the press, the Supreme Court ruled that in the United States, there can never be prior restraint on the press. You can move against journalists after publication, but before publication, the government does not have the power to say you can't publish material. And so roll the camera forward to 2013. This is, a couple of months, not more than that, after the existence of Edward Snowden is known, and The Guardian and the Washington Post have begun to publish stories based on the massive amount of material that Snowden took. I mean, to compare the Pentagon Papers era to 2013 is very interesting because, as I said, Ellsberg had to take the Pentagon Papers volume by volume out of the government's hands and then take the volumes to a copy shop where, he had to pay, I think it was 10 cents a copy then, but, pay to copy every page. It was a very laborious process. And then, you compare that to Snowden, who's working for Booz Allen he had worked at the NSA, he's working as a contractor in an office in Honolulu, and he has the ability to download and copy 2 million NSA classified files, just in one almost big whoosh. And the Snowden document appropriation, I'll call it, is the largest leak of classified material in U.S. history. Needless to say, as executive editor of the Times, and the Times had, not only been in its glory publishing the Pentagon Papers, but in 2005, we had published the first story by Jim Risen and Eric Lischblau about the NSA's secret surveillance program, which then was illegal because the Bush administration was eavesdropping on U.S. citizens without getting something called a FISA warrant, which was at that point legally required. The Times had broken that story, but Snowden had not come to the Times with his documents. He had gone to Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian and to Laura Poitras, who some of you may know. She has, made a movie that's just come out about Snowden called Citizen 4. So Snowden was in touch with Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, and also a reporter from the Washington Post. Snowden did not want to go to the New York Times, and Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, was able to tell me why. Snowden had been angry at the New York Times because we held the 2005 NSA story for a year before we published it, because the Bush administration was saying this eavesdropping program was a crown jewel in our counterterrorism efforts, and that the Times would have literal blood on its hands if it published the story. I'll go into a little bit more detail later about why we did publish, but we ultimately did publish a story and actually won a Pulitzer Prize for it. But Snowden was angry and thought the Times and its editors, including me, that we'd been too timid at that point. And I was, needless to say, like, sick at heart, because here the Times had been scooped on this very, very important set of stories which flowed out of the Snowden documents. That they revealed the PRISM program, where the actual content of conversations between US citizens and people abroad who were supposedly suspected of terrorism, that the phone companies were giving the government access to actually the content, as well as just, you know, the massive surveillance where phone records of basically almost every call were being turned over to the NSA. These were enormous stories, and I was enormously anxious and sad that the Times was not the newspaper publishing them. But in the summer of 2013, Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, called me. I knew him pretty well because the Times and The Guardian had worked together really well on all the WikiLeaks material, which was another big national security leak. And we got to know each other well during that collaboration. And Alan was coming to me because in Britain, unlike the US, where we can't have prior restraint, Britain has much less rigorous press freedom laws. They actually have a National Secrets Act, and basically the British government had told Rusbridger that they were going to demand that the Snowden documents be either destroyed or returned to the government. The Snowden documents involved a lot of classified information about the NSA, but also tons of documents about GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the American spy agencies. And Alan came to me because he was worried that The Guardian would lose custody of the Snowden material. And he knew from working on WikiLeaks that the Times was very trustworthy and careful about how, once we obtained classified documents, how we work with them and how we went about our work. So he called me and said, I'm going to be sending you a package. And he chose a trusted courier, someone who I knew well and that he knew well, to travel from London to New York. And this person came to my office with what's like a tiny envelope, just contrasting it again with these heavy documents that Ellsberg had to go to great lengths to conceal. You know, millions of NSA or GCHQ documents in this case were, you know, on a little thumb drive. And the first thing I did is put that material in a safe in the Times legal department. And it turned out that Alan was prescient and wise to give this material to the Times, because the government did come, the British government did go to the Guardian, and it hacked to pieces all of the computers on which they had their GCHQ material. And when I had dinner with Alan in New York, about 3 weeks after the courier had arrived, he had a souvenir in the pocket of his suit, which he took out, was a little shard of a computer file that had been like hammered by the British authorities. But a little bit like Punch, I knew that, the Post and the Guardian had begun publishing stories about things like the PRISM program and other aspects of this very sweeping eavesdropping that the NSA, in partnership with GCHQ, was collecting. And I was worried that we were again on just questionable legal ground. The New York Times in-house lawyers, and they're fantastic, they were certain that, the Pentagon Papers case decision by the Supreme Court and other precedents would make it impossible for the government to take legal action against the Times. But while I didn't imagine that helicopters were coming to take me away, I worried, and I consulted secretly, just on my own, a classmate of mine who was a litigation partner at Paul Weiss and very experienced in First Amendment cases. And I asked him to go back to the Pentagon Papers and go over all the case law since then and just give me a second set of eyes, a second opinion on whether, the Obama administration might be emboldened to try to prevent the Times from publishing anything. And he agreed with the Times' lawyers that this was highly unlikely, but looking at these 8 leak investigations, some of which began during the Bush administration, but which Obama chose to continue to prosecute once he had become president, he said that it was very surprising and disturbing that the administration, when it came to the issue of leaks, was basically every bit, if not more so, aggressive than the Bush administration. And in terms of the law, and again, this nettlesome Woodrow Wilson era law, the 1917 Espionage Act, my Paul Weiss partner advisor felt like it was not 100% out of question that something could happen. Unlikely, but not impossible. Anyway, that even if he had come back with a different, more alarmist point of view on this, I still would have felt the news stories based on the material as at the times we began to review it was so newsworthy, so important for the public to know about, that I would have pushed to go ahead and publish stories in any event. And basically what we had to do at the Times is, even more than during WikiLeaks, we set up a completely secret little office on a floor of the Times that's very far away from the newsroom. Very, very few editors at the Times knew that we even had the Snowden material. And I, in consultation with just a few editors who I confided in, picked a very small team of reporters and editors, and they worked in a completely windowless room because we were worried that we would be snooped on. And the Guardian in London, I had gone over there to talk to them and see what their working situation was like. They worked like they put shades over their windows. No journalist working on the material was allowed to bring in a cell phone because cell phones can actually be turned into listening devices pretty easily. Something to keep in mind, all of you. And even we had to not let people bring styrofoam coffee cups into the room because actually those, amazingly, according to our colleagues at The Guardian, can be turned into listening devices. So the one thing I felt terrible that, you know, these colleagues of mine were working in this airless, windowless room, and so the one thing I felt I could do for them, besides talk to them about their stories and, you know, express my incredible enthusiasm for their work, I thought, at least I can keep them well fed. So I made sure to have food, a lot of like deli platters delivered. And about 3 weeks into the project, I noticed that this small group of editors and reporters, they were gaining weight. The next thing that happened, it was probably around July of 2013, I got a call. It was the most polite call I think I've ever received. An impeccable British accent was on the line. It was the British ambassador inviting me to make a visit to the British Embassy in Washington. Which I accepted, and in the summer of 2013, I went to see a number of officials at the British Embassy, and I wasn't surprised. In the politest possible way, they requested that if I had Snowden documents, would I please consider returning them? And I was careful at that point not to confirm that we had the documents. I don't think we had yet published our first big story. But, you know, I listened, and, you know, he told me why it would be very harmful to the broader war on terrorism to continue making public the Snowden material. And, you know, I thought I didn't, because they were so polite and they gave me, you know, tea and very beautiful china cups and delicious cakes. I felt it was, and I hadn't said whether we had the material or not, so I decided it wouldn't be right to just tell him no on the spot. But the next day, when I was back in New York, I called him to say, if I had the documents, I would not be returning them to my friends in the embassy. The same day that I went to see the officials at the British Embassy, as long as I was going to Washington, I made an appointment to see James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence. And I had a very compelling reason why I wanted to see him. The Obama, he is the top official involved in intelligence gathering and, you know, sort of in a supervisory role of the NSA. And Clapper had become the official who most frequently in the Obama administration called me with requests for the Times not to publish stories these are not Snowden-related stories. These are stories based on other, you know, on information that that the Times' great national security reporters got from their sources about intelligence operations. And basically, the Obama administration, much like the Bush administration, the stories that they were most sensitive about revealed something about the sources and methods of intelligence gathering. And right before my visit in Washington to Clapper, he had called me. It was one of the most bizarre situations I'd been in. I was, on Fridays, I almost always was in transit from New York to Connecticut. I'd just take a commuter train. My husband and I have a weekend house in Connecticut. And I was on the train, which was extremely crowded. It was a very public place. And Clapper called me on my cell phone. And, you know, in the middle of this crowded train car, I had the director of national intelligence telling me that if the Times went ahead and published a story that we had in the works for the next day that was about a specific phone call intercept involving people in Yemen and then in Afghanistan, that if we published that story and revealed information about the parties who was actually having this conversation, that we were going to wreck an intelligence operation that was happening in real time. And all of you probably don't remember, but there was a period when many foreign embassies actually told their employees to leave the embassies because they were worried about an impending attack. And so Clapper, at the point he's talking to me, thinks there is an impending attack, which in the end there wasn't, but in real time he thought there might be. And he felt that this intercept was a live communications channel where the U.S. was getting valuable intelligence, and he wanted me to kill the story. Just decide completely not to publish it. And in as hushed a voice as I could muster and still be heard on my cell phone, I got off the call with him and consulted with the reporters and editors who had worked on that story. And we went ahead and published the story. We withheld a lot of the details about we didn't publish the names of who was involved in the conversation. And I felt in real time it was a responsible decision. We were giving the public compelling and important information about something, but without revealing too much about sources and methods, because to write about the specific intercept, the government felt would do that. But literally one day later, a competitor of the Times published that story with all the details, claiming that they got all of the information on the ground in one of the foreign countries in Yemen where the conversation was taking place. And, you know, again, I just ended up feeling burned. Here I had decided to withhold, you know, information which would have made our story a lot stronger and more compelling. And it appeared elsewhere. And so I went to see Clapper to argue that the Obama administration had to have kind of a higher bar for when they would ask for stories to not run. Between the Bush administration, when I was both Washington bureau chief and managing editor of the Times, and the Obama years, I'd say that these requests to actually not publish an entire story, maybe a dozen such requests came my way between Bush and Obama. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a usual practice, but what I went to talk to Clapper about is I felt that any time I would consider such a request in the future. I wanted the request to come directly from President Obama. Not that I expected President Obama to get on the phone to me, but I did expect that his national security advisor would. And I felt that way because at least the executive, at least the White House and the president, who is elected, and then his constitutional oath is to uphold the Constitution. At least I felt in the White House they have some understanding of the First Amendment and the press's role given to us and protected under the First Amendment. It's first for a reason, to inform the public. And I assume poor Mr. Clapper, he had trudged into the office, he had thrown his back out, so he was in a lot of pain. And he resisted rolling his eyes, but here I was in his office giving him a constitutional lesson about the founders of our country. I was actually quoting Madison and Jefferson, and reminding him, which I felt he needed to be reminded of, that the founders of our country were deathly afraid of tyrannical, over-centralized government power. And they felt that the press, journalists, were a main bulwark against excesses of centralized government, and that was the role of the press. And I think most of you know that Jefferson famously said that if he had to choose between having a government or no newspapers, or newspapers without government, he would actually choose the latter because of this fear of central authority running amok. And Clapper listened respectfully. I don't think it actually changed his view, which is, as someone whose job was centered on protecting national security, he felt keeping secrets was far more important than keeping the public informed. So our meeting ended with us more or less agreeing to disagree. But he did actually hear me out, which I give him credit for. And part of my distress over these requests not to publish stories is linked to the fact that there are so many criminal prosecutions involving leakers. In the 8 cases that have been filed under Bush and Obama, the leakers are all whistleblowers. They're all people who work for the government and felt that they were witnessing illegal or abusive government power, and they went to reporters, including in at least 3 of the cases, reporters for the New York Times, with the information because they felt it was their duty to inform the public, to make this public. And in 8 of these cases, the leakers faced prosecution. And in a bunch of these cases, the reporters who broke the stories were subpoenaed to give information because there were criminal leak investigations. And what the government was trying to get to the bottom of is, how did the reporters get these stories? Who were their sources? And the national security reporters of the Times had told me, beginning really in about 2004, that these leak investigations were making their work impossible. Sources who used to take their calls were so fearful that they would be the subject of leak investigations that they were telling the Times reporters, don't ever call me again. That the atmosphere in which the New York Times or Joe worked at the Washington Post for doing national security coverage had just become completely almost impossible. And, that is part of why, if it was just the request about adjusting and holding back information from particular stories, I don't think I would have been as worked up. But, the fact that they've had 8 of these cases using the obscure Woodrow Wilson 1917 espionage law, I think is really, it's too much, and I think these cases really are not in the public interest. The Obama administration's view is keeping the country secure and preventing another terrorist attack overrides the urgency or public good of getting the information out. And I just don't buy it. I don't. And, I would say at the times, I feel that closer to 9/11, in terms of the original NSA story that we held for a year and published in 2005, we first learned about NSA eavesdropping at the end of 2004. And I think because that was closer to 9/11, that the press back then, like closer to 9/11, that the press was, if anything, too timid back then. And by my last years as executive editor of the Times, I think the mainstream press got its priorities straight and was fulfilling the role that both the founders and the First Amendment intended for us. Making the decisions of whether, to publish stories involving, sensitive national security intelligence are difficult. I never felt that the government, when they made these requests, I felt like their concerns were valid. Occasionally I felt the reason they didn't want material divulged to the public was to avoid political embarrassment. But most of the time, I think they were genuinely worried that getting the information out would somehow aid terrorists and give them, too much information about how and what the U.S. government can snoop about. Before we published the original NSA story, Senator Jay Rockefeller, a Democrat, it wasn't just the Bush White House back then, but Democrats, very few people in the government were even briefed about the NSA eavesdropping program. The entire Congress wasn't, and the full intelligence committees of the House and Senate weren't even briefed. So in my view, there was very little accountability built into the eavesdropping program. But Jay Rockefeller, who was the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Jane Harman, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, had been briefed about the program, and both of them called me, I was managing editor then, to say the Times should not publish the story. And Bill Keller, who was my predecessor as executive editor, and Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher, actually went to the Bush White House and met with President Bush, and he told them that the Times would have blood on its hands if we published the original NSA story. In terms of the Snowden material, the first very consequential story that we published in September of 2013 was a story that basically said encryption, which many corporations use to protect business secrets, trade secrets, that no encryption really works anymore, and that the ability of the NSA and GCHQ to Snoop knows no bounds, that encryption does not keep communications secure. That was the first story we did. And then we did probably scores of stories based on the Snowden material, which I think were very consequential. The Washington Post and The Guardian ended up, for their stories, winning the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, the same Pulitzer Prize that the Times won for the Pentagon Papers for their scoops based on the Snowden material. I guess, you know, the question that looms, and I think I've already tipped my hat about which way I would lean, but the question is the public better off knowing about the government's secret and massive eavesdropping? And without hesitation, my answer is yes. And has the publication of these stories actually harmed national security? I don't think that the Obama administration or the British government have really presented any compelling evidence that shows that the stories that have been published harm national security or pose a threat. And in closing, because I'm eager to take your questions about this or any current event, you know, in the Pentagon Papers case, which ended up covering Punch Sulzberger and the Times in glory, the Solicitor General during the Nixon administration was Erwin Griswold, who had been the dean of Harvard Law School for years and years. And Griswold is a lawyer who went before the Supreme Court to argue that the Times be stopped from publishing the Pentagon Papers. And he argued passionately that the material in the Pentagon Papers, if made public, would actually harm national security. But 10 years later, he was giving a speech to a legal group, and he actually admitted in his speech that he knew of no actual instance of harm to the country that had been caused by the publication of the Pentagon Papers. And I believe that will be true in our time too. So thanks for bearing with me for the
So Ms. Abramson has graciously agreed to answer some questions, and so as a lecturer at Woodrow Wilson School, we have a tradition of letting students ask the first few questions. So we have microphones in the aisle, so if there are any students that would like to come forward and ask some questions, please do so now. We'll be switching off from microphone to microphone, and afterwards, if some non-students have questions as well, then we can take those.
Don't be shy, please. I know from, teaching at Harvard, students are so polite these days, but get in my face.
Hi, my name is Jeanette, and I have a question about journalism as a profession. What do you think distinguishes journalism as a form of writing from any other types of writing? And what about it do you find most compelling?
Well, I think it's a great question, especially the part of your question which asks how is journalism different from other writing, because in my class at Harvard, I think my students thought it was odd that the first thing I actually assigned them to read in Introduction to Journalism is an F. Scott Fitzgerald short story. And obviously, I'm not pandering to you, Princeton people, by invoking F. Scott, but I feel a lot about his writing is very journalistic, especially the vividness with which he, describes character and motive and establishes narrative tension in what he writes. I think good journalistic writing employs a lot of the technique of the most compelling fiction. But journalism's purpose is very different, and I think journalism's central calling is what I call accountability journalism. It's stories that hold powerful people and powerful institutions accountable. And, it doesn't have to be only stories about national security. I think, when, one of my proudest legacies, as both managing editor and executive editor of the Times, was I put a huge premium and emphasis on that kind of reporting, on long investigative stories that have that as their mission. And as two examples, I'd cite, David Barboza, who is the Times correspondent in Shanghai, did these amazing investigative stories about corruption and cronyism in the government of China. And doing investigative reporting in China is very difficult, and holding Chinese power accountable is even harder than holding power here in our country accountable. So being able to support the publication of his stories. And then some of you may remember Andrea Elliott. She did a week of pieces, a very close-in portrait of a homeless girl in New York. She lived in a shelter in Brooklyn. Her name was Dasani. And in that case too, we were holding the city government in New York accountable for the perpetuation of homelessness in what is now one of the most affluent cities in the world. So I think that mission is central to great journalism and is somewhat different from other writing.
You mentioned your colleague Jim Risen, who was one of the 8 reporters who has been subpoenaed.
Yes.
And in his book, State of War, as I'm sure you know,
Yeah.
he discloses the CIA plot called Operation Merlin that was going to give the Iranians a bogus blueprint for a nuclear weapon. 2 questions about that, if I may. Number one, he makes it clear in his book that the New York Times refused to publish this story for 1 year before he went ahead and put it into his book. And I'm curious to know why the Times made that decision and how he got away with it. And secondly, why is the government continuing to threaten him with prosecution when they know perfectly well who the whistleblower
Who his
was?
sources? I mean, the government says, this is the case involving Jim Risen of the New York Times. I guess the government's position is that they don't know who the source is. There is someone who is awaiting trial named Jeffrey Sterling, who was a CIA operative, and the government is going to try to make the case that he was a source for the story, and to compel Jim's testimony. Jim has said he would go to jail rather than actually give any information in public court. Why the Times in 2003 didn't publish the story in real time, what was happening in 2003. I know the Iranian nuclear program has subsequently become a hugely compelling and important news story, but when Jim was doing his reporting, it was actually during the period, the walk-up to the Iraq War, which is, of course, another kind of stinky kettle of fish. But there was we were focused on covering Iraq, and the story that Jim presented to the Times, it was a tangle of sorts, and a consideration also was that the Bush White House and Condoleezza Rice, who was a national security advisor, was leaning heavily on us, like, not to publish the story. But it was like a combination of those things. In hindsight now, I regret that we didn't publish the story, and that Jim ultimately, shortly thereafter, did make it a chapter of his book, so it did get published. So if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it differently.
Hi, my name is Andrew Netta. I'm a junior in the Years of Studies department. My question pertains specifically to the incident you mentioned in summer 2013. I actually remember the embassy closing, so I was in Jordan when the embassy closed down there. My understanding of the situation was that the intercepted communication was between al-Zawahiri, who's the head of Al-Qaeda,
That's right.
and the head of Al-Qaeda's branch
In Yemen.
Yeah, and while the Times didn't break that information, and a different paper did, after that information was released, that line of communication went silent, and the U.S. government lost a source of information that they had been using for some time. It was actually, I lean more towards your position when it comes to these, but kid here. My question is, how do you know when the government comes to you whether there's a legitimate issue of national security or if it's a political issue?
That is a great question, and the answer is you don't. And that's what makes making those calls like very sort of fraught and difficult for any editor. And it's, you do a kind of balancing test, and the balance is sort of what I said in my prepared remarks, which is you have to balance, the importance and urgency to the public of getting information with the possible harm to national security, or even somehow aiding terrorists in some kind of plot. And it's very hard to balance those out. But the default position of the press has to be to publish. The Times doesn't publish everything. And in the case of WikiLeaks material and some of the Snowden material, we haven't published things that we possess. And even The Guardian, in the case of the Snowden material, redacted pages from an NSA training manual because they thought it gave too much detail out about how the NSA is trained to do what it does. So it's not that I'm an absolutist and I think every piece of information has to be brought to the public, but I do think because of what the press's role is in our society, that the default position is inform the public and publish. That can be overridden if you really think the threat is grave, that you would harm people. And there's some obvious things I should stipulate, like troop movements during wartime that you don't publish, identities of agents. You don't put people's lives in danger by publishing their identities. And in fact, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange came in for quite a bit of criticism because they just put everything out in public on the web, where the Times and the Guardian went through a very careful process where they made sure to redact certain things like that shouldn't be in the public arena. But it's not like there's a scientific formula for figuring out that balance.
Thank you for being here. My name is Abby. I'm a master's student here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I have a question about the journalism industry and sort of the transformations that it's undergoing right now. It seems to me the Times has weathered that transition pretty well in comparison to...
I'll be glad to hear that.
So I'm curious about sort of where you see the industry going, and particularly for papers that don't have the same resources as the Times in terms of being able to do long investigative projects and that kind of thing. what do you see as the future for the journalism industry at large?
Well, yeah, I'm going to agree to your point that, you know, the Times, though it faces its own economic challenges and they're having a bit of a staff reduction right now, their mission, they'll continue to do great investigative accountability journalism, and it will always thrive there and have a vibrant home there. I guess what distresses me more broadly is, you know, I think that so much of journalism now is just, you know, kind of done by young people who are hungry to do that kind of highest calling reporting and stories, but what they're really doing is sitting at a computer repackaging information that's already on the internet, and finding glitzy ways to get clickbait headlines and that kind of thing. And I think there's too little original reporting being done. And, you know, at the Times and the Washington Post and New Yorker and Vanity Fair and 60 Minutes are still fantastic, highest quality journalism provided to the public. But the rest of it is too frequently, and I don't mean to, I'm painting with too broad a brush. There are too many instances where entertainment is passing for journalism. Hi, I love it that like the women are coming out to ask the questions.
Why don't I actually ask 2 questions? Okay, so.
I just needed to one question.
So, this is more of a personal question, but I would say that you definitely have experience. I imagine trying to get into journalism, especially like a really big institution like New York Times, is already very difficult.
Yeah, it's true that the Times doesn't frequently hire somebody straight out of school who doesn't have some experience.
And I can imagine, like, not just experience, though, but just like, how have you found like the motivation to keep persisting in these kinds of very like difficult, very like have to be high quality all the time institutions throughout your like career?
Well, you know, what I counsel my students, whether it was when I was back in 2000 here at Princeton, I taught at a writing course at Yale for 5 years and now at Harvard, is don't limit where you want to work to only that sort of those Tiffany brands that I just reeled off. They're actually, believe it or not, you know, I know from students who have worked there that, you know, some quality journalism is being done by BuzzFeed. They have a great investigative editor named Mark Shoops, who is actually like stewarding some projects. They've published, I think, 2 so far, and they were both really good and serious. So along with the listicles, they're doing good work. So, you know, I think there are a number of new media journalism organizations where you can do great work. And, you know, I'm just plucking BuzzFeed out of the hat. But I actually think it's a great time to be a young journalist out there looking for work. You know, it's not a great time as if you want, what you want to be doing right off the bat is like a 4,000 word article. But, you know, you need to work up to that and get experience reporting in order to really deliver that kind of story.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks so much for coming. So we've been talking about this kind of situation where a government really wouldn't want you to publish some classified material, but I'm wondering about sort of the opposite case where we have groups like ISIS that are doing a lot of their propaganda that they would love to get more attention. In fact, we've been getting a lot of release from Europe and parts of the US and all these places. So what's the conversation going on right now among news organizations about how to handle and what to publish
So I'm interpreting your question not so much to be directed about information that our intelligence agencies are gathering about ISIS, but just how do news organizations deal with covering ISIS and...
Right, like how do you decide what to publish?
Yeah, I mean, because ISIS, as we know, is far more sophisticated than Al-Qaeda ever was in how to manipulate the press and use the press to spread both panic and fear and its messages. And I think so far, I mean, I was uncomfortable with some of the coverage of the beheadings of the journalists. I thought was sensationalistic, but for the most part, I think most news organizations, again, it's like a balancing test, try to be very witting about stories where they're kind of carrying ISIS's water, and again, to weigh what's really newsworthy, what do we really need to be bringing before the public, and are we falling for what is a propaganda image or message? I think that is done, and it is a little bit, like I said, about when to publish stories about classified intelligence. It's not like there's there's no rule book for editors that tells you like where that line is, but I think most editors of conscience, and there are a lot of them, really struggle with that right now.